very much for having me. And I appreciate, there's my car at the bottom there. So, and you can see my new license plate. So I'm perfect for this because apparently I ramble. So there you go. Anyway, so let's get started. Now, just to let you know, this is a Canadian perspective, and it's certainly the timing is pretty good because I think we all have a Canadian perspective these days, and it's interesting as we go through the things that they talk about, and I, here I am, 1892. Well, obviously I don't go there very often, and but just looking back and then seeing all the tariffs and things like that, it sort of echoes and resonates. And anyway, so here we go. So again, just a Canadian perspective. Basically, we're going to be looking at the Brampton plant. We do mention obviously Kenosha and places like that, but we're really looking at the Canadian perspective and what came out of the plants in Canada and how we interacted with the AMC people in the States. So anyway, here we go. So back in the beginning, this is our first Rambler bicycle. And a friend of mine has one actually, which is pretty cool. But here he is, Thomas B. Jeffrey, being photographed in his first experimental Rambler. And obviously he just stuck two bicycles together in order to get his machine going there. I don't know why they never smiled back there. If you have an idea as to why they never smiled, please let me know. But anyhow, so that's his first experimental Rambler. And he came to the United States in 1863. And in 1879, he began to manufacture bicycles under the name Rambler. His many contributions to the bicycle industry include the invention of the clincher tire. So for those who don't know what a clincher tire is, and I wasn't aware, although I did know, but I didn't know what's called the clincher tire. The clincher tire is clinched to the inside of the wheel rim with a bead of steel wire or Kevlar, and they require an inner tube to hold air. So if you have a problem with your clincher tire, then you know who to blame, or if it's not having problems, you just know who to thank. And at the turn of the century, he sold his bicycle business because he wanted to focus more on vehicles, because that was at the time, that's what things were going. They were looking for the four-wheel, they're looking to get on the move and whatnot else. He moved as well to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I can see a spelling mistake already. So anyway, here's the first Rambler. And he and his son, Charles, began manufacturing these one-cylinder Ramblers in 1902. And I have seen one, actually. I was at a car show, I don't know, probably a few years ago now, but there was one, a 1902 Rambler there. It was pretty cool. The guy was pretty good. He gave rides and everything. It was just pretty awesome. And in 1906, Jeffrey's Kenosha plant was the largest and perhaps the best equipped automobile factory in the nation. And the Rambler was the second most mass-produced automobile in America. So how about that? And Jeffrey remained president of the Thomas B. Jeffrey Company until his death in 1910. And in 1914, the Rambler name was changed to the Jeffrey. I was going to make a joke and say the Gulf of Jeffrey, but I won't. So enter the Nash man. Again, he's part of our lineage. And Charles Nash was, I just have to move myself from here. And Charles Nash was born in DeKalb, Illinois. Now, this guy had a tough childhood. I mean, I feel for the guy. And he was abandoned by his parents at age 6. He started working on the farm at age 7. Like that's just unheard of. But again, the times, they were different. And he ran away from his abusive foster home at 12. But I don't know. He certainly landed on his feet. Charles took over as the president of General Motors in 1912. Now, he was known for his prudent and frugal financial decisions. And I called him Nash the Slash. And he was vaulted into the leadership of GM after investors thought that the original founder, Billy Durant, was cooking the books, possibly. And this guy, Charles Nash, really knew what he wanted. He wanted to become a master mechanic, and he did. He also had a flair for business. So it's a perfect fit for this presidential role for GM. Anyway, Nash, business savvy, returned GM to stability. He reinvested the profits back into the company, and rather than giving them to the stockholders. Now, in 1915, there I'm back on track. He regained controlling interest in the company. So Nash knew that his time was over, and he needed to find a company where he could run the show. So boom, Nash found that company in Kenosha, which was the Jeffrey. And in 1916, that company, the Jeffrey, had fallen into debt. Nash purchased the Jeffrey plant and all the assets on July 13th, 1916, and made it into Nash Motor Company on July 29th. So when he did all that, 2 days later, he resigned from General Motors. Some say Nash said he was going fishing and he just left, but he certainly caught a big one with the Jeffrey. In 1917, the Nash trucks were everywhere, and Nash cars were coming out of the factory in 1918. And Nash was just thrilled to have his name on a vehicle. Now, when Nash first started, he joined forces with Edouard Lefebvre, a Belgian racer. Now, this guy was very technical and a great engineer, and he had a great influence on Nash's vehicles at the time. And in 1917, Nash took a step ahead in comfort by integrating a gas heater into the dashboard. So if you were warm today, you can thank Nash for that. And pledging to give the customer more than he has paid for, Nash built branch plants in Milwaukee, Racine, and Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Now, I don't know what that was all about, but I didn't want to get down too far down a rabbit hole. And during World War I, Nash negotiated contracts with the U.S. Army. So that helped him get his trucks in the forefront. In 1920, Nash Motors earnings were over $57 million with a profit of $7 million. Now that, can you imagine back then, $7 million? That's crazy. And in some years, most vehicles were sold before they even left the factory floor. So they were like hotcakes. And Nash made really no effort to sell cars in Canada, but CCM, Canada Cycle and Motor, and the parent company of Russell, manufactured in Toronto, they imported them. And when Russell went out of business in 1922, and it appears that Willys continued to import Nash cars from Kenosha. And by 1926, the Nash automobile was one of the top selling brands of cars. And another part of Charles Nash's portfolio was the luxury automaker Lafayette, and which operated out of Indiana. And then they merged it into the company in 1924. Now, Charles Nash had again, very savvy business acumen, and he didn't want to be in debt at all. So it really served him well during the Depression. And Nash Motors first used the Ambassador name to describe a trim option. So it was a really advanced vehicle for the time. And that Ambassador became a distinct model beginning in 1932, known as the Kenosha Duesenbergs. Now, I don't know if you've heard that term before. And again, they offered high quality, power, and comfort. And they were always looking ahead and trying to get better. And the company leaned towards safety by using tempered glass for windshields to protect their passengers. Despite the company's success and profitability in the 20s, Nash lacked the financial resources of its non-debt adverse major competitors. So Ford, GM, and Chrysler, they didn't mind borrowing money, so they had more. And unfortunately, Charles didn't. But the company remained profitable for most of the 30s, but they did so by drastically reducing production and employment. In the 30s, Nash merged with Kelvinator Corporation, makers of home appliances. And the president, George Mason, had automotive experience with Studebaker, Dodge, and Chrysler. Now, Charles Nash, at that point, when George Mason came in, Charles Nash basically was on his way out. He was just trying to get someone like George Mason into his company so that he could trust him in moving it forward. So Nash was elected chairman of the board at Nash Kelvinator, and Mason was president of Nash Kelvinator and director of Kelvinator Canada. Now, Nash Motors of Canada Limited was first organized in 1939 with headquarters in Windsor as a distribution arm of the parent company in Detroit. Now, Charles felt, as I say, Charles Nash felt good. So he basically took his wife and went down to Beverly Hills and retired. So in 1941, Nash Motors introduced a popular new model, the 600, and it's interesting, named for the number of miles you could travel on a 20-gallon tank of gas. Now, under Mason's watch, Nash Motors became a more forward-looking than ever, and engineers developed a radical unibody 600 vehicle, and that was poised to take on the low-price Ford and Chevrolet. The 600 was the first mass-produced automobile to use the unibody construction, which body panels were welded directly to the frame. And this produced a lighter, stronger car with increased rigidity and better gas mileage. And the 600, which included other attractive features, sold for a modest $700 to $850. They were a huge success. They sold about 80,000 units. Now, between 1942 and 44, of course, that's the war, and Nash's factory turned to building Pratt & Whitney engines under the contract for the Navy and other wartime needs. So there's one of the ads that was going at that time. Now, in 1945, Nash got a jump on the other company's poor production, selling over 6,000 cars. This made the company the number 3 automaker. Now, after World War II, Ottawa threatened to shut down American automobile manufacturers who didn't assemble cars in this country. Again, it's echoing really strangely at this point to me. But anyhow, Nash spent $1.4 million in 1946 to purchase a mothballed plant in Toronto from Ford of Canada. And this is the picture of the active Ford in Canada plant. And that was located at the corner of Danforth and Victoria Park. I don't know if anybody knows where that is, but it certainly was the end of, civilization back then. And because there was all it was fields after that. Of course, not now, but that back then it was. Now, Charles Nash died on June 6, 1948. He was 84 years old. And here's what a little plaque that was put on a residence that he was in. Now, Charles Nash was very savvy, but he was very thoughtful. He left quite a legacy. He made generous investments in young people, including the Nash Lodge and the Kenosha Youth Foundation. So a very, very thoughtful person. And because of his strong post-war sales, it meant that the company could sell all the cars it could make. Now, Nash stuck with minor changes to the Ambassador's pre-war styling through the 48 years. So again, it was easier for them, but a little bit of tweaking here and there would get you by, I guess. Nash committed itself to the unibody manufacture for all its models, and in 1949, a completely restyled Ambassador was introduced, built with that unitized body. Now, the Airflight, you've probably seen them, or they call bathtubs, but the famed bathtubs appeared for the 1949 season, and these luxurious land yachts were the finest Nash had ever produced, and the public snapped them up as fast as they could roll them out of the assembly line. Now, Nash Motors of Canada didn't open up until April of 1950 due to unstable currency conditions. And when the plant finally did open, a Canadian Statesman was the first model built, and there was 1,150 of them. Now, the Nash cars began rolling off the lines in September, as I mentioned, September of 1950. They were pleased with the total of not just this Canadian Statesman, but about just over 3,800 models were built that year. And in June of 1952, company officials announced that it would be adding the popular Nash Canadian Rambler. Now, once again, startup was delayed. There's always something going on. But in December, cars started moving down the lines, and the first Nash Canadian Rambler was completed on March 10th, 1953. Sold for $2,460, but certainly it wouldn't be sold for $2,460 now. The compact 100-inch wheelbase Rambler carried many features that cost extra on other brands of cars. The fully dressed Rambler, convertible with a radio, heater, leather-trimmed interior, white wall tires, and full wheel covers, cost only a few more dollars than a stripped Chevy. Now, Rambler promptly became the darling of the well-to-do, and surveys said that the Rambler was the second car of the family, and the other one potentially being the Cadillac. Okay, that was Nash. Now we move along into Hudson. And the Hudson Motor Car Company was founded by auto pioneers Howard Coffin, George Dunham, and Roy E. Chapin. I highlighted that. Just try and keep that name in the back of your mind for now. And the largely funded by department store owner Joseph L. Hudson. So in 1910, 1 year after it was created, they were the 11th automobile company in America. Now, Joseph L. Hudson of Detroit, he was a department store mogul, and he put up $90,000 of personal money for the project. Chapin and Coffin had earned Hudson's confidence because of their experience with the automotive world while working at the Olds Motor Works in Lansing, Michigan. Now, this is a funny one because Hudson early cork clutch was smooth and surprisingly durable. I don't have any problem removing corks from wine bottles either, because I'm pretty smooth at that. But they also had the first balanced crankshaft used in their straight six engine to smooth the idle and allow the engine to rev higher. Now, Hudson was one of the first to place oil pressure and generator warning lights in the dashboard. I don't know if you knew that or not, but now you do. Now, in 1919, Hudson brought out its Essex line. It was inexpensive, steel-bodied to compete with Ford and Chevrolet. Kind of a cool looking beast there. Now, the Essex was launched as a 4-cylinder in 1919, and by 1924, it was a 6-cylinder. And Essex had factories in Canada, England, and Belgium, and made Hudson the third largest automaker in the United States. How about that? And even with the 1920 recession, the new line quickly established itself, and within 10 years, the brand was challenging Chevrolet, as you could see that. Now, Hudson Peak was in, I'm going to move myself again. There we go. Okay. Hudson's Peak was in 1929 when the company produced no less than 300,000 Hudson and Essex cars worldwide. In 1938, though, the line was renamed to Hudson 112, and the Hudson began building cars in Canada through a contract with Canada Top and Body in Tilbury, Ontario. It was a very unusual arrangement because Hudson didn't actually perform any of the assembly operations. That was contracted out to Canadian Top and Body Corporation, and they were already fabricating parts and even bodies for other automakers, including Grey Dort and Ford. Now, Hudson introduced the electric hand transmission in 1935. It sounds pretty revolutionary. It was a revolutionary device that employed a button to shift gears instead of the usual stick shift. However, it became notoriously for operating incorrectly, which is never a good thing. Now, in 1936, Hudson brought out its radial safety control or rhythmic ride suspension. This let Hudson use longer and softer leaf springs for a smoother ride, and while remaining very stable. Now, after the death of Roy Chapin in 1936, A.E. Barrett was named the president, and having started the company as a stenographer, the A.E. Barrett, in 1910. And his management allowed Hudson to realize a small turnaround in profits, but ultimately Hudson lost market share. In 1940, Hudson replaced the radial safety control suspension with an independent front suspension, and which was unusual in its price range. And 2 years later, Hudson brought out the DriveMaster transmission and had the option of the DriveMaster vacuum-assisted clutch. All sounds pretty good. And then for World War II, Hudson converted its factories to make war materials, and like many military boats were powered by Hudson Invader engines. The Commodore was introduced in 1941, but the production of the Commodore resumed in 1946 after World War II, with designing very similar to its pre-war versions. And after World War II, Hudson was reluctant to reestablish assembly in Canada because of stiff taxes imposed on automobile purchasers. again, it's echoing again, more taxes and more tariffs. Chatco purchased Canadian Top and Body in 1947, and the company expanded into the manufacture of white goods. And in 1948, Commodore line received step-down styling. In 1942 was a Commodore's last year of production. Hudson won a number of competitive events, stressing economy, speed, and hill climbing, but all of those accolades didn't lead to much sales. So now the Hudson Hornet, that's probably everyone knows about that. From 1951 to 1954, it was based on the Commodore and ran with the look using a bored-out version of the standard L-head straight six. And the Hudson, like other independent automakers, fell out of favor with the consumers in the 1950s. Production of the Jet, which the Jet is the bottom left of your screen, the production of the Jet was the only model produced in Tilbury, Ontario, had declined to a dismal 654 units for the entire 1954 model year. And yet another 218 of the larger Hudsons were imported from the US. Now, the Hudson Hornet was successful in NASCAR for many years, and it probably kept the sales of Hudsons going. And who doesn't want to thank Pixar for, making us Doc Hudson, because that was certainly bringing that fabulous Hudson Hornet back into view. And during 1953 and 54, Hudson also sold a car called the Wasp, a slightly shorter wheelbase, but with the same basic unit body and shell. Here we go, a merger to build on this foundation. Amid fierce market competition in 1954, Nash struggled against the larger fish in the automotive manufacturer's pond. Now, George Mason orchestrated where Nash would purchase the Hudson Motor Car Company to create AMC. Now, that was initially potentially going to be called Rebel Motor Company, but obviously the name AMC, or American Motors, was chosen. American Motors, but wait, before the amalgamation of Hudson and Nash Kelvinator in early January of 1954, Packard Motor Company, I don't know if you knew this, but Packard Motor Company was in play to join the party. Now, this whole project was under a heavy cloak of secrecy with cones of silence, meeting in back rooms, secret handshakes in the Michigan headquarters, and weekend work in employees' homes. So they were driven and focused on this merger. So were we going to get a Nash-Paxson? I don't know. So what they were talking about, 3 divisions would be used for the 3 companies, and economies would be achieved during manufacturing, and each would use existing distribution dealerships, which was great because they were already established. Designs were mocked up where the styles would be mashed together, and that's why I said so a Nash-Paxson, together creating the best of all existing body lines. In the end, it came down to a bit of a power struggle. I don't know if you know James J. Nance. He wasn't happy with his projected role as GM of Packard, seeing as how he was already at Packard, and he was going to be promoted to the VP of the company. He felt he should be leading this union and excused himself from the deal. And then eventually, if you know this, eventually Packard merged with Studebaker. So we didn't have it anyway. Okay. Are we having fun yet? Okay, so and what was the largest corporate merger in U.S. history at the time? Nash Kelvinator agreed to merge with Hudson Motor Car Company and form AMC, and that was on January 14th. However, May 1st, 1954 was announced as its official amalgamation date. Now, retiring Hudson President A.E. Barrett is on the left with the guy with the white hair, and unfortunately, George Mason passed away on October 12th. So he didn't really get to be that long in the driver's seat. So George Romney, who's the guy on the right holding the sign, is named AMC chairman, president, and general manager. And the 1955 model year was looming very quickly as the companies were brought together, and the automotive industry was popping at that time. So analysts were saying it's going to be the biggest one yet. So obviously AMC needed to get their stuff in gear and get going. So that certainly prompted Hudson designers and engineers to scramble like mad in an all-out effort to create a new look, which they've been wearing the same the same pants, as it were, for 7 seasons, apparently. And there was neither time nor money to develop a new exterior. That's certainly what they always say. We don't have the money to do that. So Hudson would eventually share sheet metal with Nash. That's hard to say. Do that a few times fast. Anyway, Nash and Hudson people began coordinating the planned shared assembly of the two brands in the small Toronto plant. So here we are, oh, Canada. And the little Rambler would now do double duty, and it would wear the Hudson emblem with honor. Let's see. Yeah, and this was complex because with the addition of the Hudson Wasp, there would now be 3 distinct vehicles to come off the line in a very small plant. That stylish Nash Rambler was built as in Toronto, as I mentioned, and as well as a Nash Canadian Statesman. And the domestically built Wasp was billed as Canada's smartest new car in the low to medium price field. And a tiny bonus for Hudson dealers was the addition of the pint-sized imported Metropolitan on showroom floors. And the one thing about that was that they didn't have to build them because they came from overseas. And we're going to talk about that. For 1955 and 57, the Metropolitan was sold under both the Nash and Hudson names, with the grille and horn badges being the only difference between them. So you can see on the taxed to death car, that's the Nash. And it's hard to see on the other one, and I couldn't get another Hudson plate of the grill badge, but I tried. So the production of the Metropolitan began in October of 1953. Now, the original cars were badged NKI Custom, that is Nash Kelvinator International. And the first cars arrived in North America in December of 1953. And on January 22nd, 1954, the name was officially changed to Metropolitan. They were designed in the US, and Fisher and Ludlow Limited built the body, and the mechanical outfitting was done by Austin Motor Company Limited. Both companies were in Birmingham, England. Now, one of the things that I did find out or learn that Romney, and you remember seeing him with the sign, he went over to Austin and asked them if he could buy them, but they politely declined, as they would probably do that. But he also went across, well, I guess maybe even while he was there over in Europe, he went over to Volkswagen and asked if he could buy them. Again, that was declined as well. So can you imagine what would have happened back that? Anyway, the Hudson Motor Company of Canada Limited and Nash Kelvinator were finally amalgamated into American Motors Canada Limited nearly 2 years later on January 1st, 1956. And that factory, located on the Danforth in Toronto, a total of 5,700 Nash and Hudson's cars were built, and built that year, and the sales were up significantly over 1955. Now, those officials who had worried so much at the start of the season now had plenty to brag about at its end. Sales were up, and a total of 85 Nash and Hudson units were built in Toronto. And I realize I've got 2 different numbers up there, but it's just how it was, I guess. Now, the Hudson facility in Tilbury, Ontario was shut down, and Hudson's sales office was moved to a new address on the Queensway. Actually, not too far from where I grew up, actually. I grew up in Etobicoke, and I probably went by there all the time. Maybe, no, certainly not at that time, but anyway, so we're on the Queensway in Toronto rather than at the Nash plant on the Danforth, and that opened up on September 1st. Now, gone was the dowdy compact Hudson Jet, and both Nash and Hudson's would offer the smart compact Rambler, and again with their own little mark badging. And that parts department was moved to the Nash plant on the Danforth over a civic holiday weekend, so no holidays for those guys back then. Now, the Grand Nash name would be laid to rest at the end of the 1957 season. Now, unfortunately, they weren't selling, so it was time to move on from the Nash name. And it had apparently outgrown its usefulness, and customers lost confidence. Now, the Canadian operation, opened in 1950, had been highly unprofitable, and when AMC found itself in financial straits, the Danforth factory was shut down at the end of the 57 years. So no Nash or Hudson's cars were built in Toronto that year. Now, the Nash legacy and heritage would live on in the spirit of the Rambler. It's a very It's a beautiful little compact car for the time. Now, Canadians were hungry for compact cars, and fortunately, Nash had an ace up its sleeve with that Rambler. Now, Ramblers were imported in 58, but they cost more, and they came from very profitable production lines in Kenosha and Milwaukee. Canadian sales of Ramblers were at an all-time high, but again, they had that tariff, that duty at 17%. And but even with that duty, people bought over 10,000 of those Ramblers. And that pushed up sales 73% over the previous year and more than 100% in 1960, despite the devalued Canadian dollar. Now, Roy Chapin Jr., so if you remember back, the Chapin name, this is his son, president of the Canadian AMC operations, he was so certain that a Canadian plant was an essential part of the continental game, he swore to his boss, George Romney, he would use his own money to build a factory. And apparently that did it because Romney bought it and he was satisfied that Canadians could build Ramblers. And so Chapin he went out to set up a first-rate manufacturing team, and they had a first media scrum on January 19th, 1960. Now, at that scrum, AMC officials and the Honorable Gordon Churchill, Federal Minister of Trade and Commerce, held a press conference where 43-year-old Earl K. Brownridge was introduced as Vice President and General Manager. And then they met with Ontario Premier Leslie Frost to confirm these appointments. Now, it was funny that AMC had a paint, it was called Frost White. Now, I don't know if that had anything to do with this Ontario Premier or not, but it could have. Now, Chapin Jr. found Earl Kitchener Brownridge at his family home in Smiths Falls, Ontario. Now, Earl was born in Toronto as a fourth-generation Canadian. Now, he quit grade 10 to work at Eaton's for $8 a week. When that gig wasn't advancing quickly enough, that 15-year-old headed to the nickel mines in Sudbury. I don't know what caused him to do that, but hey, he had the vision. Now, just a little issue, a little thing that came up one day. That thirsty teen, Earl Brownridge, was refused a drink of water by his foreman, and Earl said, that's enough. I've had it, and he quit. And then he signed up for duty as a gunner in the RCAF, but due to poor health, he was dismissed. Again, not to be discouraged, he went to work for Victory Aircraft and did a time study plan in order to get efficient, and it increased production substantially. And once that was looked at and implemented, he was promoted to department head. So this guy had some very good business acumen as well. Now, he was ahead of an experimental manufacturing, and he led a team of 75 talented engineers, and they built a gas turbine engine in the spring of 48. Now, that Chinook took off, and the orders for the jet engine poured in worldwide. And Orenda Engines became a subsidiary of Avro in 1955, and Brownridge ended up being VP. And he won the coveted McCurdy Trophy awarded to the Canadians for outstanding contributions to the nation's aviation industry. When the government canceled the Aero in 1959, that was it. President Brownridge resigned. Now, Roy G. Chapin, be ready when opportunity comes. Luck is the time when preparation and opportunity meet. So President Brownridge, Earl, left that company. He was going to go to a cushy job with a British aerospace firm in the same industry, but he retreated. He needed a break. And that's when Roy D. Chapin found him. And Brownridge and AMC got lucky. Now, this plan that they had, they wanted to reactivate the Nash plant in Toronto to start building more AMC cars in Canada. The facility, as I mentioned, had been shut down in 57. It was unprofitable. Even though there were still 50 employees working in there, I find that very hard to believe, but that's what they tell me. And by March, it was determined that neither the existing plant or even annexing some land that was owned by Kelvinator Canada and Home Appliances was suitable. Well, now what? Remember that slide we just looked at about luck, along came Dr. Kenneth A. Roberts. Now, Roberts was a wealthy physician with a talent for successful gold mining ventures. I'm not sure how those two kind of play together, but hey, that's what it was. And he had diversified his vast holdings and he went into real estate. Now, this tycoon could see that the Danforth was an up-and-coming part of Toronto, and the old Nash plant could be refurbished into a very profitable, covered roof, climate-controlled shopping center complex. So Roberts offered to swap a 4-acre tract of farmland that he owned by Peel Village Development near Brampton and for the plant on Danforth. So he threw in some cash and backed the deal with $1 million personal fortune. Now, the rambling fields of Brampton terrain, they needed a massage. That 196 cubic yards of soil needed to be moved to make the terrain flat enough for AMC's requirements. And when Earl Brownridge was kidded by the press as to Doc Roberts' chances of failure in such an unusual venture, well, he grinned, well, then we get Roberts Gold Mines. Now, that's a picture of a very early picture, 1964, of what the Brampton AMC plant looked like. Now, it's a graceful one-story edifice that required 95,000 bricks, 45,000 concrete blocks, and 8,400 cubic yards of concrete and tons of structural steel to complete. There was also 4 self-contained fireproof divisions, and they all came with a sprinkler system. Now, the plant was a modern wonder. Brownridge worked with the planning engineer and consultants. They created a beautiful manufacturing center tailoring to our Canadians' needs. When they broke ground and manufactured the architecture to make the plant one of ultimate efficiency. Now, the heating and water supplies were all unique and subject of many articles in newspapers and magazines. Entire walls were made to be quickly knocked down. For ease of expansion, the light fixtures were suspended from movable ducts, and all electrical plumbing was installed with growth in mind. Now, the AMC plant was too close to Malton Airport to permit construction of a water tower. You may notice that previous slide, there was no water tower. So an underground tank with a capacity of 250,000 imperial gallons of water was sunk into the earth. Now, the local water was too acidic for automaking requirements, so giant water softeners and purifiers were custom built to make the water usable. Now, the most impressive thing was how quickly it was built. Now, soil was broken on June 14th, 1960, and only 3 months later, on September 15th, the first part of the building was occupied. Now, on October 1st, process equipment was installed before the floor was laid or the roof installed, and the office staff moved from the Danforth plant 15 days later on November 30th, and the plant was completely closed in at that time. Now, Dr. Roberts turned over the factory to American Motors, and the rumors leaked to the press that AMC pocketed a whopping $3.5 million in cash on that real estate swap. So that was a good start. I think they found the pot of gold there. Now, the Brampton facility had a total area of 250,000 square feet, 196,000 of which was slated for the assembly area, and 34,000 went to parts, and 20,000 was reserved for offices. Now, American Motors Canada had a thrifty corporate structure. They had a highly deserved reputation for innovation and flexibility. There was no fancy divisions of hierarchies in Brampton. The president's office was within hollering distance of the boys when an executive meeting needed to be called, and Earl Brownridge's office was a meager 12 square feet. Now, Brownridge bragged about his team of 5 to the press. Harry Shotton makes Ramblers, Leo Fenn sells Ramblers, A.J. Miles looked after the Rambler money, and Neil Gaskin buys Canadian. And it was that simple. These 5 guys were friends, aside from being co-workers, and they, as you can see in the picture, they're probably making some decisions in each other's backyard and potentially over a good scotch. Now, Brownridge rated the competition for its best talent. Harry Shotton was hired away from Chrysler to be the works manager. Neil Gaskin came from Studebaker in Hamilton as a purchaser. James Wooland became personnel manager. Employees moved in while workers scrambled to finish the factory. excitement electrified employees and the 245 Rambler dealers across Canada. Now, the first Rambler rolled off the line on Christmas Eve, 1960. Now, I didn't have the exact picture, but that was this car. It happened to be a blue four-door classic. This looks more like maybe white or maybe even pink, but workers were determined to keep their promise to the boss to have production rolling. Before Christmas, Neil Gaskin recalls the momentous event. We went into the office and asked Earl to come out on the floor, that we had something to show him. When he saw the completed Rambler, he was overcome with emotion. It was a tremendous gift and just a glimpse of what the highly spirited Rambler team would accomplish. The historic Rambler was national news on December 28th. Now, the official plant was opening on January 26th, and there was a snowstorm accompanied by a wild snow. Wow. See, there was a big snowstorm because there was two snowstorms all at once. There was plenty to celebrate. George Romney was there, and Roy D. Chapin was there. It was a great, grandiose occasion. And thousands visit, even despite of two snowstorms. When the federal minister of Energy and Resources pushed the button to open the production line doors, transport trucks loaded with their first Ramblers drove dramatically past the crowd on their way to deliver cars to dealers. Now, first quarter earnings put the operation solidly in the black. Now, success was long-term if Rambler Canada didn't copy Detroit. Now, Canada's small, they do things the Canadian way was one of Brown Ridge's most important maxims. And the team came up with a novel way to lower import duty. In April, the company began shipping Rambler Canadian steel to Gary, Indiana and Milwaukee, Wisconsin for stamping that pushed the Rambler's Canadian content upwards from 45% to 53%. And when you have that much Canadian content, you pay less tariff and less tax. In May of 61, the Brampton plant built 672 cars. Vehicle orders poured in steadily in October. Production increased 25%, and the shifts were extended to 10 hours to meet the demand. Now, Ramblers were hotter than the sun when it came to sales at this time, and compact Ramblers took 21% of the market compared to Chevy at 17. Now, CBC Earl Cameron, he used promotional models in fish bowls filled with water to show viewers how Ramblers were deep dipped 7 times to prevent rusting. And in May 1962, Brampton was building 1,600 cars a month, 128% higher than the previous year. And AMC announced it was going to expand, and they won a contract from the Department of Defense. So Ramblers served with distinction in all 4 branches of Her Majesty's Canadian Armed Forces. In 1963, Motor Trend gave its annual Car of the Year award to the American Motors Rambler for its outstanding achievement in design. Pretty good. Now, Roy Abernathy, CEO of the parent company, and Earl Brown Ridge were honored at the banquet by Motor Trend, where they received a massive trophy. A personal dream came true for Brown Ridge as the plant began building right-hand drive Ramblers for Commonwealth countries' export, and that was vital to the company's long-term health. Hey, anytime you can sell a car, you got to do it. Now, Commonwealth membership saved $400 off each unit, and Canadian Ramblers were shipped to Britain, Cyprus, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Southern Rhodesia that first year. Brown Ridge announced that Brampton would be exporting $4 million worth of parts to Kenosha. So drive shaft torque tubes, bumper supports, headlamp assemblies, and engine block castings would be exported. And the parts warehouse had to double to keep up with the demand for Ramblers. And 400 new jobs were created for the companies that supported parts for Ramblers. And that was including Hayes Steel Products of Thorold, Ontario Steel Products of Chatham, Canadian Motor Lamp Company in Windsor, and the Holmes Foundry Limited in Sarnia. The Ontario government honored the company by presenting it with its first ever Achievement Award for its outstanding contribution to the growth of the provincial economy. This award was well-deserved, and if a part could be made at home, AMC Canada spent $5.4 million for imported parts in 1961, but only $30,000 worth of imported parts in 1963. That's quite a drop in non-Canadian parts. Now, Brownridge, who was always thinking, invited 250 members of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association to Brampton to coincide with the 60th anniversary of the very first Rambler. Now, parts makers viewed a display of all Rambler's imported components and asked them to place bids. As a result, Canadian content rose again. Of the 8,000 individual parts that made up a Rambler, 5,500 were domestic, complying with Canadian content laws, and they earned AMC valuable export credits, which cut the import duties substantially. Now, here's a picture of the floor, the production floor at Brampton. Now, in June, Crawley Films Limited released the movie Brampton Builds a Car. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a copy of that. Not that I was going to show it at this, but I would have certainly loved to have seen it. The program aired on CBC in primetime. 28 copies of the color movie were made to loan out to church groups and civic organizations. 4 million Canadians watched that award-winning documentary film starring the homegrown Ramblers. And by the end of the 1963 campaign, Ramblers owned 7.39% of the Canadian market. And the dealer network was 320 strong. Now, President Earl Brownridge, he was very personal, and he could say that he knew every one of his dealers by name. And a record 27, almost 28,000 units were being built, and a very handsome $50 million in profit. It was an astonishing feat for a company that had been $12 million in red only 6 years earlier. Now, the Brampton plant doubled in production capacity to handle production of the 64 Rambler lineup. And there was $400,000 that had been spent to purchase another tract of land for expansion. And a cafeteria, a small hospital, conference rooms, and special computer housing were all part of the upgrade. At the press conference, he told reporters on January 1st, 1964 Ramblers would be equipped with seat belts, and that compact American convertibles would be built in Brampton. These beautiful little convertibles sold for less than $3,000. Be lucky if you could get one with another zero on there. But anyhow, they were the least expensive convertible in the domestic market. Those models were hot. The press praised Rambler for holding on to its Car of the Year styling. Canadians could choose from 14 solid colors and 14 two-tone combinations. Rambler capitalized in the fact that it was the only Canadian car to offer headrest for an option and seatbelts as standard features. It took 2 full days to build a complete Rambler in 1964. The conveyor belt moved at the rate of a mile a minute. Each man spent 6.5 minutes completing their tasks. There were 8,000 individual parts and 9,000 welds in every car. Now, Ramblers were well made. There were no recalls of any kind. Unfortunately, in 1964, Brampton was forced to shut down for a week. Kenosha shut down to correct production and inventory balances. Now, that's a picture of the Kenosha plant. There's a famous walkway, and I've seen it. That's of course, down in Kenosha. So Brampton couldn't operate without Kenosha-sourced components. And so there was nothing for Canadian workers to do but go home and shovel snow. And Brampton employees were given 50% of their pay during that enforced timeout. And unfortunately, 800 Ramblers didn't get built that week. Sure, Earl wasn't comfortable with that. The Brampton operation experienced more growing pains to comply with the antiquated 1936 Canadian content laws that govern automotive manufacturing to be 60% homegrown as soon as production hit 30,000 units. Now, that's a picture, as it says, an AMC 287 engine block. The engine assembly plant was the solution. The new building went up in the spring of 1964 at a cost of $2.5 million. There was 700,000 square feet of space. In the United States, compacts fell out of favor with the buying public. In May, some assembly lines were stopped down in the States, but the Canadian love for the Rambler stayed the course. Production was at an all-time high of 34,872 units. Now, AMC was listening as consumers wanted a larger Rambler and designers would oblige for them. The 1965 Ambassador gained 4 inches in the wheelbase and got smartly styled stacked quad headlights. Now, Ambassadors and Classics were squared up to look more important, and the very popular pint-sized Rambler got some minor tweaks. Now, the 1965 Ramblers rolled off the lines earlier than usual, starting in the first week of August 1964. Consumers approved of the sales slogan, "The Sensible Spectaculars." A Canada-wide survey revealed that the majority of Rambler owners were highly satisfied with their present cars and intended to buy another one. That's always good news. Now, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson and Lyndon B. Johnson met on January 18th to sign an automotive tariff agreement. By doing so, they headed off a particularly nasty court case. The U.S. car makers were accusing Canada of unfairly subsidizing and dumping parts into the States. I don't know much more about that. But the Auto Pact would allow manufacturers to ship vehicles and parts without duty. Oh, that's the best. And the Canadian auto industry would be forever changed. Well, I think we've changed again. But anyway, let's not go there. So there's the brochure for the Sensible Spectaculars. Now that the Auto Pact was in place, American Motors Canada was quick to ship $6 million worth of components to the U.S. And the Rambler was the first Canadian domestic to export cars into the U.S. Every month of the 1965 production line, Brampton supplied to dealers in New England and the mid-Atlantic states. American Motors Limited celebrated the 100,000th Rambler, and it rolled off the assembly line in February of 1965. Now, apparently the milestone event was recorded for posterity, but I could not find anything on that. And I'm very disappointed because I don't know what the 100,000th Rambler was. And I'm going to find out. But for now, it was one of these three. So there's the, down at the bottom, that's the Ambassador. That's the Classic to the right. And then at the top, that's the Rambler American. So it's one of those. They won the 100,000th off. Another reason for celebration in 1965 was that Earl Brownridge received a Society for Advancement of Management's highest award. It was the first time the International Association had honored a Canadian. His acceptance speech highlighted the reasons for his success. Human relations, rather than stylish procedures, was a principle he lived by in dealing with all of 1,700 of the company's employees. Brownridge also joked that he tried to get someone from the office to accept the award, but he couldn't persuade them to work on Saturday. The 1966 model year started off with 1,200 employees walking out on a wildcat strike, just as the first vehicle rolled off the assembly line. The company denied the charge that there was a problem with the assembly line, and then it went on for about 5.5 weeks as the union wanted to get wages and benefits similar to what other auto workers negotiated in Windsor, Oakville, and Oshawa. There were only 70 completed cars on hand for the fall introduction, and another 700 were quickly imported so that the public could at least see the new lineup on October 7th. And the automotive landscape was changing again, and AMC was evolving with it. The Rambler name, long known for economy and safety for an older generation, was being removed from the Ambassador and Marlin line. There was still the Rambler American. Earl Brownridge announced substantial price reductions on the 66 models, and you can see the different the prices. The Marlin went down by $269, Ambassadors just by $22, Classics was $187, and the Rambler American. Now they had a 199 6-cylinder motor. This one was a 232, so that was a step up. Anyway, safety basically sold cars to Canadians in 1966. AMC offered 6 seat belts as standard equipment, and Brownridge reminded the public that Rambler was the first with the stronger, more protective, all-welded unit bodies and double safety brakes. Last year's safety options became standard equipment. Padded instrument panels, backup lights, outside rear view mirrors, and windshield washers did not cost a dime extra. And here's time for a change. So AMC unleashed the sizzling Vignale AMX, Cavalier, AMX2, and Vixen show cars in January at the Society of Automotive Engineers Convention in Detroit. And the media sent pictures of the fabulous foursome all across the country, and the public ate it up. The concept cars were shown to a select audience in Toronto. So these were supposed to be the shape of things to come. I mean, you could probably see some of the cars that, if you know AMC, you can see some of the cars, how they evolved from here. Now, Fred Phillips of Canada, he's out in Calgary, owns the Vignali AMX prototype. That's the one down in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, in a February press conference, AMC announced it would be installing collapsible steering units in its 1967 models. And Ford and Chrysler quickly followed to suit the Canadian Safety Council, but they praised AMC for forward thinking since their devices weren't required. And Harry Schotten, Vice President of Manufacturing, was quoted as saying, "We think that the motorist is entitled to as much protection as we can give him." Now, AMC Canada still found success with increased sales, and $3.5 million would be spent on an assembly line and enlarging the parts warehouse. Now, AMC in the States was struggling. Now, their retail sales were off by 4,000 units. Now, hopefully the Fab Four tour piqued the interest of the public, and certainly the papers were helping. It was Canada's centennial year, and the whole country was festive. American Motors gained national exposure by entering 3 Rambler Americans in a 4,000-mile cross-country rally. The finish line was the front gates of Expo 67 in Montreal. Production rose again for 67 to over 33,000 units, and in 68, AMC outperformed national industry production with a 26% increase. Now, in 1967, Brownridge was appointed Executive Vice President of American Motors in Detroit. He ran back and forth from Brampton to an apartment in Michigan. And unfortunately, that may have been the straw that broke his back, because he took a leave from AMC and ran for Parliament. Now, he didn't win, and then he left AMC. And Earl had had enough of a break, and he found a job as president of Formosa Springs Brewery in Barrie. And he was then picked to be the head of Brewers Retail. And Brownridge died of cancer in 1973. When the hearse left the church, it made its way to the cemetery, deliberately passing by 335 Kennedy Road. And as the funeral procession passed slowly by, many employees had one last chance to say goodbye to their boss, their friend, and their mentor. Earl Kitchener Brownridge was a great industrial hero. When President Earl Brownridge took his leave in 1968, Neil Gaskin had eyes on the president's position. He had been an original member of the Group of Five from the beginning, coming over from Studebaker, and he certainly made Detroit know that he was interested in the position. Now, Canadians would have more confidence with a Canadian leader, and all the other manufacturers had one. Unfortunately, it was announced that the job had been given to someone named Lawrence G. Rice. Now, Rice fit the bill because he was originally from Vancouver and had been hired away from Chrysler UK. Now, Gaskin, always a team player, he was disappointed, but he towed the line. Gaskin went to Britain to meet Rice, and he met his family at the airport. Gaskin took Rice all across Canada to meet the dealers, but the dealers didn't take quite a shine to Rice and wanted to quit the dealer network. And Gaskin and Rice had some disagreements too. So Gaskin handed in his letter of resignation, and it was made public on November 1st after the 1969 models were introduced. And after AMC, Neil eventually made it as president of the Canadian Automobile Association. Some of his accomplishments were initiating the CAA Insurance Company, the CAA Travel Agency, and the CAA Magazine. Neil Dennis Gaskin died at the age of 82 in December of 2004. And in 2016, Gaskin was honored for his significant contribution while working at Studebaker Hamilton plant for 12 years. He was added to the list of honorees on the Studebaker of Canada plaque, and that is at the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, Indiana. And that's a picture of the plaque. While this was, in my opinion, the most exciting times for AMC, because 68 to 70, when you had all the AMXs coming out and the scramblers and the fast cars and the big motors, There's very little I could find on Lawrence Rice and his accomplishments and efforts to push AMC along. But Brampton continued to push out rebels, American, and ambassadors at a very good pace. But look out, here comes a great addition to AMC. Here comes Jeep. At the time, Kaiser Corporation was a huge worldwide operation. They were into steel, aluminum, healthcare, shipbuilding, and massive construction project. Kaiser Jeep was a very, very small piece of their operation. Now, Jeep only sold about 300 units through its 100 dealers Canada-wide from its modest Windsor assembly plant. What made Jeep profitable was government contracts. The Windsor Jeep facility assembled a little bit of everything. Now, Jeep was wrapping up production of the flat nose FC and FC 150 and the 170, and they was introducing the J series. Now, that FC is forward control. That's actually a Hot Wheels. I bought that at I think it was in Florida, and it was in the grocery store that I was at. But anyway, the plant built the little dispatcher DJ5s and DJ6. 6 is for the Windsor Police Department. Now, as I mentioned, forward control was FC, DJ is dispatcher Jeep, and the Federal Anti-Combine Act made it illegal for large corporations to sell the products of other large corporations. GM and Chrysler dealers would have loved to carry the Jeep, but couldn't. Some of the larger companies' dealers did cover up the fact that they were selling Jeeps. As military contracts were projected to dry up in the 70s, Kaiser decided to spin off Jeep to someone. Now, Earl Brownridge and Gordon Munro of Jeep Canada knew each other very well, and it was a perfect fit that Jeeps would roll over to AMC for $80 million. It was definitely a win-win for both companies, and Jeep dealers started selling AMC passenger cars as soon as they could get organized after the takeover. Now, the name of Jeep, you may have your own thoughts on this, but there's a couple of theories of origin. In the 40s, as a military vehicle, it was a general purpose vehicle and may have been given the nickname Jeep. Kind of goes together. But there is also a character in the Popeye comic called Jeep, as you can see on the left. Now, other Jeep slangs, CJ, civilian Jeep. The 2-letter model codes for the Jeep Wrangler generation, such as YJ, TJ, JK, and JL, help differentiate the body styles, but don't stand for anything in particular, so I'm told. And we're going to change again because here comes Bill Pickett. Now, the shine had dimmed in AMC's Canada's crown in 1971. The confidence was down at a time when the American operation was hard on the comeback trail. So we've got Canadian going down, US going up. And so AMC brought in another Jeep guy. Now, Pickett's task was to hit the floor running to reverse the trend of the former President Rice's rule. Now, Bill was born in Toledo, Ohio, and he received degrees from the University of Toledo and University of Texas, and he served in the Army. He began his career with Jeep Corporation and held vice presidential positions at American Motors Corporation in both international and domestic sales before traveling to Canada as president of American Motors Canada. Now, Bill's resume, as I mentioned, included heading military development teams for both CJ5 and the M3A1, which was a military Jeep program. Pickett was very much a people person, which is great because the other managers or Earl Brownridge, it was very personal. Unfortunately, Larry Rice might not have been, but the media loved him because he was always quotable and he would always give good headlines for the papers. He headed cross-country, giving speeches and personally selling cars at well-publicized events. He voiced radio ads where he invited the public to drop by to a dealer, and he rolled up his sleeves and went to work selling cars. And you could hear him over the ad. He did his own voiceovers and whatnot else. So people drank that up. They were giveaways, and there was A&W root beer. So he was like hands-on all the way. Pickett also found that the dealer network had too many large markets without an AMC dealer. He beefed up the sales managers and added a new national sales manager, with Ron Hogue taking that position. Bill said that Hogue was a fireball. And Ron had Nash Motors in his blood because he came from Nash. Now, another problem, according to Bill, was fleet sales. When Pickett arrived, there weren't any fleet program customers. This program is established with healthy allowances for selling cars. All the dealers were excited and got into fleet and leasing right away. Pickett knew the Canadian market and chose to cater to it. And instead of using sales methods, Bill said Canadians don't get that grizzly when it comes to sales. He added the X factor to the Gremlin in Canada for the 1971 line. And the US didn't want to do it. They thought the Gremlin was going to die, and head office was opposed to the idea, but they let Bill Pickett. He quickly felt the wind and sold the Gremlin X package to the dealers for what it cost. For what it cost the factory to attach the X. Jeffrey Lynch started selling these Gremlin X jobs like crazy, so dealers loaded them like they were diamonds, and eventually the States got on the X side. And Pickett kickstarted sales, and his efforts started to correct the downward trend toward the end of 1971. Bill started to get more creative, and AMC offered the Green Hornet for 1972. This was a specially trimmed Hornet. They cashed in on the success of the radio serial and TV series. There were 300 of them built so that each dealer across the country could have one. There were only 249 dealers at that time, and these were a Canada-only model. And there's the advertisement for that car. The guarantee that protects you from getting stung. How's that? A Greek philosopher once said, the only constant in life is change. Well, Bill walked that line every day. The game changer in 1972 was that AMC was now offering a warranty. American Motors Corporation offered the buyer protection plan that provided warranty for new cars. The buyer protection plan included a 12-month, 12,000 mile or 19,000 kilometer warranty that covered most of the car except for the tires. It certainly caught the attention of the buying public, and later on, as an enhancement, AMC also offered a buyer protection plan too that covered twice as long. So 2 years, 24,000 miles, or 38,000 kilometers. In 1973, Datsun, Toyota, or I guess before, probably 1972, but Datsun, Toyota, and Mazda had control over America's small truck market. Now, AMC thought about this, saddled up with the Cowboy prototype, and it was versus the Hornet hatchback. So while the Cowboy was under development, so was a hatchback proposal with the existing Hornet sedan. And emotions ran high between the rival teams, each touting their prototype as being the next surefire winner. Facilities in Kenosha and Milwaukee were already running at maximum capacity, and it became clear that only one of the two new body styles would be produced, and whichever one was chosen, it would be built at the Canadian plant. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but I think they made the right decision by going with the hatchback, but I'm really kind of disappointed that we didn't get the Cowboy, but I guess it was ride a Gremlin and save a Cowboy or something like that. The last major change that Pickett would oversee was when he went to Ottawa to announce that AMC would be producing Jeeps in 1979. Now, the government offered to send dignitaries, but Premier Bill Davis had already offered to attend and would drive the first Jeep out of the plant. Another picture disaster, because I really wanted to have that on this slide. I did sign up for the Star, and I looked, and they had this beautiful little article that I could put here. Unfortunately, the picture at the top of the page was something from Chrysler, and obviously that didn't fit. So sorry about that. I would love to have it, the first Jeep off the assembly line. So, and there was 1,000 Davis followers who attended the gala event as well, but no pictures of them either. So that's fine. The multiple award-winning and well-respected Bill Pickett retired from AMC in 1981. He was able to bring AMC back from a brink, and when he left the company saying, so the little Canadian operation made nothing but money for the Americans. And he passed away on June the 5th, 2008, at the age of 88. In the meantime, Renault purchased, or probably before he retired, but They purchased 22% interest in the ailing AMC in 1979. AMC got the 200 million it needed to stay alive, and Renault got the 15, almost 1,600 dealerships in the US and another 224 in Canada, so it could sell its technologically advanced vehicles. And the leadership was handed over to Maurice Ferty. Some thought that Ron Hogue would succeed Bill Pickett, but Renault, because they had that interest, they flexed its investment muscles for this appointment. Now, Ferty had seen service with Renault in Scandinavia, Holland, the United States, Africa, Australia, and Turkey before taking on this role. I guess going to Canada maybe completed his bingo card. I'm not sure, but the hot Jeep line was a bonus and a solid and sold alongside Renault around the world. So they could take those Jeeps and put them anywhere that Renault was. It looked like a good deal for both parties, but how could this go wrong? AMC needed more, so Renault increased its stake in American Motors to 46% in September of 1980. Now, in 1981, the North American auto industry was in poor shape, as much of the world's economy was very, very much in a recession. The Big Four produced only 24% of the world's 39 million vehicles in 1980, down from 85% in 1950. I got this right off a government website, so you can see that the domestics they're shrinking a little bit. Not terrible, but wasn't the best. Now, Canadians used to trade cars every 5 years, but now they hung on to them for an extra 18 months in hopes of an economic turnaround. AMC, with 200 dealers, and Renault surprisingly had close to 300 across Canada. The new collaboration held about 3% of the domestic market. Now, it's interesting as Quebec alone accounted for almost half of the new combined sales. Now, during the merger in Brampton, some AMC employees didn't approve of this new structure. Some were very vocal against the merger, and those who did usually ended up unemployed. And the Brampton plant was reeling. The employees were not used to this organizational structure. The plant manager didn't even report to the Canadian president, and a lot of the production was sent stateside. So they were worried about losing their jobs, obviously. And the plant was idle for 6 months during a changeover, and just a few Jeeps idled off the line, and Eagle was being assembled at the rate of 500 units a week. And the aging Concorde was still being assembled in Brampton with only 750 employees working the line. AMC was actually in danger of violating the Canada-US Auto Pact Agreement, which required a minimum ratio of domestically built vehicles to total sales. Marketing strategies needed to change in order to get a new vision to the Canadian public. And the new advertising company engaged the one that Renault used and replaced the national one that AMC used since the 50s. And you can see that Renault was making some major waves and putting what their thoughts were, understandably so, but eventually the resolution of marketing conflict was that the US side took over all of the marketing in order to eliminate any regional differences. The US AMC president at the time, Jose Dierdewarder, had a personal dislike for the French culture. His advice to the Canadian side was it really needed to focus on the Renault portion of your operation, as that was helping the bottom line for AMC as a whole. Now, AMC on the Canadian side was losing whatever grip they thought they had in the 80s. Their executives had little to no power on lines of authority. Every direction came from Detroit. Everyone who challenged that, it was replaced. When Ferty tried to get action from Paris, he was given a go to Detroit answer. Now, there were some bright spots from outside the AMC Renault walls, and the AMC Alliance hit the streets in the fall of '82 as an '83 model, and it had won the title of the Car of the Year in Europe and was accorded the same honor in North America. That little winner was imported from Kenosha. Canadians snapped up 888 of the small little cars in its first 14 days on the market. Sales for AMC was up overall when all other domestic automakers except Volvo stalled. Renault was helping AMC make another one of its famous comebacks. Final sales figures for the calendar year provided total revenue for the fiscal year of $258 million. And Morris Fairty had a heart attack on August 18th, 1983. Obviously, the stress of the internal daily conflict certainly attributed to that medical issue. And it happened while Maurice was attending the North America dealer announcement dinner in Nevada. Now, Les Bink from Jeep had happened to see Fairty, who was a heavy smoker, collapse as he entered his room. Fairty unfortunately rushed himself back to work after he recovered from that, and now Detroit quietly ordered him to handle special assignments. And that way they could keep a close eye on him and prevent the outspoken president from pestering Renault about making Canada an independent subsidiary. And they probably restricted his international calls from his desk too. That'd be what I would think. In 83, the bottom line was $354 million in total revenue for AMC. AMC Jeep Renault Canada newly downsized and award-winning Cherokee and Wagoneers translated into a sales boom of 163%. Renault 5 Alliance and Encore sales rose to, and AMC announced first quarter profit of $5.1 million. In 84, Werder was bullish on the corporation future. 12 million shares of stock were snapped up in less than 4 hours after being issued. They raised 140 million US. Fairty rallied hard for a new product to be built if Canada was to be a serious player in the automotive process, and they needed to locally produce a vehicle. And he won. And in the process, he got a super plant thrown into the deal. AMC Canada would build an all-new intermediate-sized car code named X58. It was obviously called the Premier. You probably know that. It would be new from the ground up and built expressly for the North American market. And Canada would be the only source for this car. It would come from a new $764 million super plant to be built in Bramalea near Brampton. The car would be made with many Canadian components that suppliers could make, as many components that suppliers could make. Production was estimated to be $160,000 a year. In 85, the Renault 5 was thrown out of the lineup, even though it was so popular in Canada. Detroit said that it wasn't good enough seller to continue importing into the US. Now, Fairty lamented that an important and growing domestic product segment was destroyed without any consultation from Canada. He's getting upset again, understandably so. And things went from bad to worse in 85 as Detroit ordered Brampton to cut 25% of its personnel and control their costs. That included a 10% pay cut. What were they thinking? A wage rollback was illegal under Canadian law. Then Detroit backed off. Back on the Brampton saddle, an outraged Fairty wrote a letter to Paris where he concisely outlined the dangerous and unprofitable road that his Canadian operations was forced to travel. An autonomous AMC Renault Canada Limited would be free to offer full line of vehicles that didn't depend on Detroit's whims or American buyer preferences. And he was tired of repeating himself. Well, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Oh, no, not so much. Possibly. After all the complaining that Fairty did to Paris about Detroit doing them dirty, on January 20th, 1986, Fairty was allowed to slip away from his position, and a new voice, American, Bill Carroll, was given a special vice presidency and took over sales and marketing in Brampton. Again, Brampton protested Carroll's appointment and strongly recommended Winnipeg native Ron Hogue would be the right man for the job. Detroit told Fairty not to speak to the press about the new Canadian super plant, and that might indicate to Canadian media that AMC Renault was too shaky for that undertaking. All those rumors could cause employee nervousness, dealers to leave, and sales to plummet. Fairty finally fit into a position in Detroit, taking charge of the international development of the Jeep line, and his son was attending university in the US, so that was a perfect position. And the super plant was finally under construction in Bramalea. The massive E-shaped structure was designed with 2 million square feet of space, or 51 acres, under its roof. The new factory would churn out 150,000 cars a year, and employees would work closely with 120 robots programmed to spot weld, and paint. And Ottawa would kick in $120 million for the project. Eventually, that figure would rise to 200 million. Some of the biggest Canadian banks would contribute another 300 million. The first premieres were scheduled to roll out the doors on Canada on July 1st, 1987. There would be 220 transport shipments a day once they started to assemble them. Well, the rumor mill was rife with an AMC dump. Frustrated and discouraged during some of his time at AMC, Ferdy decided to call it a career at AMC and retire in Toronto. Had anyone been listening to Maurice Ferdy, American Motors Canada may have had a completely different ending. This is an FYI. I don't know that anyone would know this because this is another thing that I learned during this research. This is George Bessy, CEO of Renault, and he was gunned down in front of his Paris home on November 17th, 1986. His aggressive cost-cutting measures in trying to revive his unprofitable country, Renault, didn't sit well with the employees and his executive team. Some say that part of the reason for his murder was he was invested far too much for far too long in AMC. Renault and Chrysler signed off on the sale of AMC on August 5th, 1987. The cherries of the sale were the Jeep line, the new modern plant, the dealership network, and the very talented 1,800 Brampton employees. The sale was for $1.5 billion. This is the first consolidation in the domestic auto industry since 1954. What happened in 1954? Okay. Anyway, the last Eagle rolled off the assembly line in Canada was a wagon produced on December 14th, 1987 at the Brampton Assembly Plant in Brampton, Ontario. About 700 premiers left the factory wearing AMC decals. And I think that should have been Bramley. So if you go back, American Motors production, this is the Brampton plant, obviously. So wasn't sure how to present this. I thought I'd break it down into decades. So the 1960s, you can see what kind of cars they produced and the different years. My car was a 65 Rambler Ambassador. I believe it was built in Canada, in Brampton. I want to say October, I think. In 1960s, just over 257,000, almost 258,000. And in 1970s, 500,000 cars were produced in Brampton. You can see the years and all the different Hornets. And then down in 79, the Jeeps came into being. And here's the 80s, where a lot of Jeeps, some Concords, some Eagles, some Spirits. It's interesting. I was trying to find out what that AMC Eagle SX4 one unit produced, but couldn't find anything on that either. And I got this from Wikipedia. So what happened? Basically, it was a slow process, as you could tell. The energy crisis punch in the 70s and recession jabs that followed hurt AMC, but they always got up from the canvas. And development dollars were spent on the Pacer. There was a lot of development dollars spent on the Pacer. It wasn't covered in this presentation, but the Pacer was supposed to have a Wankel or rotary engine from GM. GM canceled that program, and AMC needed to move to a straight 6 engine, which required more money to develop. So that certainly, added a bit of debt to their load. Overall, AMC overreacted to the first energy crisis and all but abandoned the larger, more profitable intermediate cars. And Japan was all over the small car market, and AMC had a hard time competing with them. Jeep was a bread and butter for AMC, and they spent a lot of money converting the plants to make them. And there was a Jeep collapse in the early 80s, which, again, the bottom line, it's always about that. Renault had AMC right where they wanted them, and as they begged for capital to keep going, you could see they went from 22% to then 46%. Once Renault was in control, you saw Maurice Ferdy battle both Detroit and Paris. So he certainly, no wonder he had a heart attack. In Paris, dollars were hard to come by for AMC-based vehicles. They were not spending anything on AMC vehicles other than the Premier. And timing was an issue, as the alliance may have come at a couple of years late, and the premiere didn't catch on as well as what it's hoped. AMC just basically ran out of gas and threw in the towel as a coach. Renault sold him out. And that's about it. It's my email address. Again, just a car guy that goes way back. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Again, want to thank my club, AMO Plus, and it started out as a Classic AMX Club of Central Canada, AMO down in the States, that's American Motors Owners Association, and thanks to my wife Sonia for leaving me down in the basement to put this all together and for helping me where she could. Had a couple of little encore pieces. AMC in 67 gave a car to Miss Canada. Now, the story goes that she needed to take driving lessons in order to be able to get this car from here and there. If you go back a second, I got most of the information out of a book, Rambler Canada, the little company that could. James C. Mays, he's passed, I think, I forget who, he's passed, unfortunately. But he had this car, and obviously it's been sold to someone else. But that book, if anybody's interested, is a very, very good book. I barely skimmed the surface. Another little encore thing. Bob Bannerman, you may know, Bob Bannerman Motors was a big, big AMC dealer in Toronto. They had a sponsored AMX race car. It's kind of cool. Nice pictures that I could find. It was nice to be able to find them. This is that Green Hornet, those Green Hornet cars that I was talking about, that they made 300 and they sent them out across to the Canadian dealers. This guy has two of them, which is amazing. And I can't remember where I got them, but I think somebody put this up and I may have responded to a Facebook post or something, and he sent me these pictures. I was like, wow, that's pretty awesome. And how about that? Do you remember the Hell Drivers? And AMC Canada sponsored the Hell Drivers. I live close to London, and the twins, who were the premier drivers, are probably those two guys just beside the guy in the middle. Those are the twins, and his son has got one of these cars that he's restored. It's pretty awesome. But these guys went around and they did all kinds of dangerous driving and jumped through things and up on two wheels and whatnot else for the Canadian National Exhibition and down the States and whatnot else. They started with Ramblers and then ended up with Javelins. Here's Gremlins in the line. I don't know how you would, tell somebody there's a problem when, we're talking about Gremlins. I mean, I guess the Gremlin name has evolved a bit since that time, but a little bit of a joke there. But anyway, I found that was an interesting picture. And this is the Vignale AMX, that prototype. The interior, it's a 4-speed, which is kind of cool. And I'm sure people ate it up, and I would have loved to seen that produced as well. But the AMX was pretty good as well. That's the end. Yep, that's the end. That's the end.
Thanks so much, Gary. That was impressively thorough. We've got some questions coming in. Well, I'll start it off with a comment in answer to your question. Maureen very rightly pointed out midway through that people didn't smile in old photos because the shutter speed was so slow. So if you smiled, your face would usually end up blurry.
Oh,
excellent point, Maureen.
Mark's
asking.
I thought it was prohibition.
Bit of column A, bit of column B. Mark's asking, what was it about the Ramblers that made them so successful in the early 60s? Was it, just value for money? Was it design, innovation? Were they just sort of the right car in the right place?
I think a lot of that I think is quite true. The cost, for one thing. I mean, I did mention that you could get a whole bunch of some options that other car makers were not giving you, and it would be, you could buy a fully loaded Rambler for a very non-loaded Chevy or whatever. So, and I think they were cute. I think they were well built. I think the safety was good. I think they had a lot of stuff. Oh, and don't forget, this may not have been the best feature for some, but the seats did fold back and you could make a bed out of them. I mean, if it was certainly a little more flexible, I guess. And it's good for some things, but maybe not for others. But
Going back, there's sort of a question I always ask when it comes to early Canadian car production. Obviously, when Jeep joined the organization, that they cornered the market on trucks pretty effectively. What did early Hudson and Nash truck production look like, if anything?
um, I don't think they didn't have a pickup. I don't think they ever put together a pickup. There was a prototype of a Hudson pickup that I saw a picture of, which looked fantastic. Um, but yeah, Nash, of course, in the war, they picked up on trucks and whatnot else. Um, maybe they were just having a hard time focusing on one type of vehicle. And if they were to expand on something, that would sort of maybe leave them thin. And again, there's development dollars, there's sheet metal, there's all kinds of things that they would have to do. So I think that's probably, you gotta know your lane and try and do the best you can in your lane. If you're doing well in that lane, well, then you are making money and you can expand. So that's where I think we're probably at.
What happened to all, because this is unusual in many of our talks and in automotive history in general, for the sheer number of different car makers that come together here. Obviously, Jeep is still around as a brand to some degree, but what happened to Nash and Hudson? Does anybody keep those brands current in any way?
Current in what?
Is there anybody producing anything under
No,
the Nash brand or under the
no,
Hudson brand? It's not.
no, no. It's ceased to exist. Basically, it's yeah. I mean, you're seeing some manufacturers. You bring back certain names of cars. I've seen that maybe GM is going to bring out a GTO for 2025.
Yeah.
Just for, hey, let's relive that time in our lives. And again, it's going to pique interest. It's different. People, and Challenger was the same thing. It's but no, Hudson and Nash, that's it.
Our regular contributor, Phil, hi Phil, great to see you, is asking what happened. Do we know what happened to the Kennedy Road plant in Brampton? Because I know that the Toronto plant on Danforth is still very much recognizable, but what about the other one?
No, it's been destroyed.
Mm.
In 93, they had a car show there. It was called the Last Roundup. And I was there. And Northern Ramblers, I think were they the ones that put that show together, possibly. But that was again in 93. So everybody just sort of parked in the parking lot and showed their cars. But it's you drive by there now and there's nothing.
Mm.
Absolutely gone.